Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had some time to recharge because today we're going to examine a topic that, frankly, most people around the world still misunderstand. What we're seeing unfold in the Middle East right now is not simply another regional clash. It's not just a conventional war between long-standing rivals. What we are watching may actually be the early stage of something much larger, potentially the beginning of one of the biggest economic confrontations of the modern era. If current trends continue, the outcome of this conflict will not only influence the future of a few countries in the region, it could reshape the structure of the global financial system itself. The problem is that many observers are interpreting the situation through the wrong lens. They see missile strikes, air raids, and damaged infrastructure on television, and they assume the conflict is driven by familiar motivations, territory, ideology, or historical grievances. Those factors certainly exist, but if you step back and analyze the incentives of the players involved, especially through frameworks like strategic competition or game theory, a different picture begins to emerge. At its core, this conflict is not primarily about land. It is not even primarily about religion. It is about money, and not just ordinary money. We're talking about a global financial framework worth tens of trillions of dollars, a system that has shaped international economics for more than 50 years. To understand the situation today, we first need to understand how the modern global economy is structured, because the system we live in didn't simply emerge by accident, it was constructed. After the Second World War, the United States emerged as the dominant economic and military power. Its industrial capacity remained intact while much of the world had been devastated. Its military strength was unmatched, and its currency, the dollar, gradually became the backbone of global trade. Over time, what scholars now call the American-led international order began to form. But the most important pillar of that system wasn't just military alliances or democratic values. It was a financial structure that linked energy markets, currency flows, and global trade into a single interconnected network. At the center of that system was oil. Oil is the fuel of the modern economy. Transportation systems rely on it. Manufacturing depends on it. Agriculture uses it extensively. Nearly every industrial process in the world is connected to energy consumption in one form or another. Because of that, the country that influences how oil is traded gains enormous leverage over the broader global economy. This is where the concept of the petrodollar system becomes important. Under this arrangement, oil transactions have largely been priced and settled in US dollars. That means countries purchasing energy must maintain large reserves of dollars to participate in global markets. When those dollars accumulate in oil exporting nations, much of that wealth eventually flows back into American financial markets through investments in bonds, equities, and other assets. For decades, this created a powerful cycle. Energy was sold in dollars. Those dollars returned to the U.S. financial system, and the resulting capital inflows helped support economic expansion in the United States. At the same time, this arrangement allowed Gulf states to accumulate extraordinary wealth. Regions that were once sparsely populated desert landscapes became some of the richest areas on the planet. Entire cities rose rapidly from the sand. Airports became global transit hubs. Skyscrapers transformed skylines. Millions of workers and entrepreneurs from around the world moved there seeking opportunity. Dubai is perhaps the most famous example of this transformation. For many years, Dubai represented an idealized version of globalization: modern infrastructure, minimal taxation, open financial markets, and a reputation for safety in a region that was often unstable. Investors from Europe, Asia, and North America viewed it as a neutral and secure financial center. But the prosperity of places like Dubai depended heavily on one crucial factor: stability. Capital is extremely sensitive to risk. When investors begin to suspect that a region might become a battlefield, money tends to leave quickly. And once the perception of safety disappears, rebuilding that confidence can take years. Now consider what happened shortly after this war began. Missiles landed across parts of the Gulf region, airspace restrictions were imposed, certain financial operations slowed or paused. The idea that the Gulf was a completely safe economic zone began to weaken almost overnight. Some wealthy individuals reportedly scrambled to leave the region, paying enormous sums for private flights. When that level of anxiety begins spreading among investors, the long-term consequences can be severe. But from a strategic standpoint, something even more interesting appears to be happening. If you examine the pattern of attacks, many of them appear to focus on infrastructure that is economically important rather than purely military. This is where the principles of game theory become useful. Imagine two competitors. One possesses enormous economic resources, advanced technology, and a network of allies around the world. The other is comparatively weaker in traditional terms. If the weaker competitor tries to fight the stronger one using identical methods, the outcome is predictable. But game theory suggests that weaker actors often succeed by altering the structure of the competition itself. Instead of confronting the stronger rival directly, they target the vulnerabilities that sustain that rival's power, and this appears to be part of the logic we are seeing in the current conflict. Iran likely understands that defeating the United States militarily in a direct confrontation is unrealistic. But that may not be the objective. The objective may instead be to disrupt elements of the economic architecture that support American global influence. Much of that architecture is concentrated around the Persian Gulf. At the entrance of the Gulf lies one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. Although relatively narrow, this passage handles a huge share of global energy shipments. Oil transported through this corridor supplies major economies across Asia, including countries such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea. If shipping through that route were significantly disrupted, the economic effects would be immediate and global. Geography also plays a crucial role. Many Gulf states occupy relatively flat terrain where critical infrastructure, oil fields, refineries, export terminals, and desalination plants sits in open environments. Across the water lies Iran, where mountainous terrain provides natural protection for military installations and missile sites. From a strategic perspective, that landscape offers defensive advantages. Now imagine how planners in Tehran might evaluate the situation. Across the Gulf are wealthy states whose economies depend heavily on centralized infrastructure, water desalination systems, energy facilities, and maritime trade routes. If even a small number of these systems are disrupted, cascading effects could spread through the entire region. This means the conflict is not simply about destroying armies, it is about applying economic pressure. Interrupt oil exports and global energy prices rise, damage desalination facilities and major cities face water shortages, create uncertainty for investors and capital begins flowing elsewhere. Because Gulf economies are deeply integrated into global finance, those shocks would not remain local, they would ripple outward. In that sense, what we may be witnessing resembles economic warfare as much as traditional warfare. Each strike becomes part of a broader strategic contest over systems rather than just territory. When analysts discuss the emergence of a multipolar world, they are often referring to precisely this type of dynamic. For decades, global stability depended heavily on the assumption that the United States could guarantee security in key economic regions. If that guarantee appears uncertain, even temporarily, the entire structure of the international order begins to shift. That brings us to the central question of today's lecture. Is the current war a temporary crisis that will eventually stabilize? Or is it the early phase of a deeper transformation in the global financial system? If the trends we are discussing continue, the consequences will extend far beyond the Middle East. They will influence global trade, energy markets, currency systems, and investment flows across the planet. That is why I refer to this situation as the $100 trillion game, because the outcome will affect a financial architecture whose scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Now that we've outlined the broader system, we can begin examining how this war is actually being fought. Most news coverage focuses on tactical details: which missiles were launched, which targets were struck, how many aircraft were involved. Those details matter, but they often obscure the deeper strategic logic. To understand the stakes, we must analyze the incentives facing each side. In modern conflicts, victory is rarely achieved by completely destroying an opponent. More often, it comes from making the cost of continuing the struggle too high, and that cost does not have to be purely military. It can be economic. During the Cold War, American military doctrine developed around technological superiority. Advanced aircraft, precision weapons, missile defense systems, and sophisticated platforms were designed to counter adversaries with comparable industrial power. For many years, this approach produced overwhelming battlefield advantages, but conflicts evolve. Instead of competing directly with high-cost technologies, Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric strategies. One example is the use of relatively inexpensive drones. From a purely technical perspective, drones may appear modest compared to advanced fighter jets or missile systems, but economically they create a different equation. Imagine defending a city with air defense interceptors that cost millions of dollars each. If an incoming drone costs only tens of thousands, even a successful interception creates an economic imbalance. Multiply that exchange repeatedly, and the defender begins spending vastly more resources than the attacker. This is what analysts mean when they discuss the economics of interception. The same logic applies to infrastructure vulnerabilities. Much of the Arabian Peninsula relies on desalination plants for fresh water. These facilities convert seawater into drinkable water for cities containing millions of people. They are essential systems. But many are located near coastlines where they are difficult to protect fully. Energy infrastructure presents similar challenges. Oil fields, pipelines, and export terminals stretch across vast desert regions. Even minor disruptions can create noticeable effects in global energy markets. Financial markets react quickly to these risks. If traders believe that energy supply might be threatened, prices adjust, insurance costs increase, investment decisions change. None of this requires total destruction. The perception of instability alone can alter economic behavior. This is particularly important because Gulf economies are deeply embedded in the global financial network. Their sovereign wealth funds have invested trillions of dollars worldwide, supporting projects ranging from infrastructure to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. If those investment flows slow due to regional instability, the effects may appear in markets far beyond the Middle East. Again, the Strait of Hormuz remains central to the equation. A narrow waterway controlling a large share of global oil exports becomes a strategic pressure point in any conflict. If shipping slows or becomes contested, energy importing countries must draw down reserves or adjust economic policy to stabilize markets. The consequences cascade through supply chains, transportation systems, and consumer prices. Beyond the material effects, there is also a psychological dimension. International power is partly about perception. For decades, the United States maintained an image of overwhelming dominance that helped deter potential challengers. If smaller actors begin to believe that aspects of the system can be contested without immediate catastrophic retaliation, they may become more willing to test those boundaries. Over time, this can reshape the global balance of power. That is why many scholars believe we are entering a multipolar era, a world where multiple powers pursue competing strategic agendas rather than relying on a single dominant guarantor of stability. In that context, the conflict we are discussing becomes more than a regional war. It becomes a contest over the future structure of the global economic system itself. Will the current framework, anchored by existing energy routes, currency arrangements, and investment flows, continue largely unchanged, or will disruptions force countries to reorganize trade, finance, and security relationships? The answer will unfold gradually. Wars that influence economic systems rarely resolve quickly. They develop over years as strategies evolve and pressures accumulate. But even at this early stage, one thing should be clear. The events in the Middle East are not just about missiles or airstrikes. They involve infrastructure networks, energy flows, financial markets, and geopolitical competition intersecting in one critical region. When those forces collide, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. And that is why historians and economists may eventually look back on this period as a turning point, because the outcome of this strategic contest will help shape the future of global trade, international finance, and geopolitical power for decades. And that is exactly why I call it the $100 trillion game.